Many people ask me questions about Stoic philosophy and practice. I've created this series to provide short answers to the most common, recurring, or confusing questions about Stoicism. So the question, and it's a really excellent question, is what is the role of the ego or the self in modern Stoicism? Is it something to be overcome, or is it something to be embraced? So let me give you a very simple answer. First, neither. It's not simply supposed to be embraced as it is, nor is it something that is just to be overcome and left behind. And we have to be careful in thinking about whether we're identifying the self with the ego. There are a lot of interesting assumptions and even extra questions bound up in this question about the self or the ego. And the first of them is a matter of clarifying our terminology. What do we mean by the ego or the self, and do we actually use them to mean the same thing? That depends on what conception we have of the ego. If we're taking something from, say, classic psychoanalytic theory or some of the spin-offs in other modern psychology, then the ego is often understood to be a part of the self rather than the totality of the self or the subject. And the ego is the part that we're most aware of, the part that we identify with. Ego means I in Latin, and it's a translation of, the German Ich as well, which is what Freud was using. So if we're thinking about the ego in that sense, we might connect that with our self-image, with what we think we're like, as opposed to how we actually are, how we do engage with the world, or the other parts of the self. So we might want to think about which term we want to use. The other thing to keep in mind is that often ego has this pejorative sense, like you're, just doing things to satisfy your ego, or that's all about this person's ego, meaning it has to do with their self-esteem and their perceived status in relation to other people, or their self-image, which they're attempting to preserve. Ask yourself, is that the same thing as the self? So that's something important to clarify from the beginning. The second thing to keep in mind is that Stoicism, whether ancient or modern, does think that we have a self, and it's identified in different ways. In Epictetus, the proairesis, or translated as faculty of choice or moral purpose, is in fact what you are. There's other things that you are as well, but that's at the very core of your being. It's not conceived of quite that way in some of the other Stoics who don't use that term, but that gives you a sense. There is a substantive self for Stoicism. Now, whether there's an ego, that depends, like I said, on what we understand by it. If we're thinking about our self-image or our consciousness of self, again, the Stoics think that we definitely have that. It could be mistaken, however. We can conceive of ourselves as much better people than we are, or as having an importance that we don't actually have, or misunderstand the way our minds and our bodies work, or any of those sorts of issues. A third and very important dimension of what's being asked about here is those subsequent questions. Should we embrace or should we overcome the self or the ego? How does Stoicism view it? So if we're thinking about ego in terms of self-image as something that isn't quite the totality of what we are, it might be something to be overcome. It's definitely not something simply to embrace, particularly if we have mistaken conceptions of who we are and what kind of being we are and our relations to other people and how developed we are and what our values happen to be. If that's the case, then we really do want to overcome that ego. Do we want to overcome the self, however? And the answer is no. From a Stoic perspective, we're not trying to get away from the self. As a matter of fact, you can't get away from the self. It's the self that's actually deciding about the self. Do we want to embrace the self? That depends on what aspects of the self we're thinking about. Stoicism is, in large part, about getting a good handle on who we are, surveying, the totality of who we are, our reactions, our thoughts, our views, our values, our choices, the history that has made us what we are, our own responsibility in that. And so we don't want to say, we embrace all of that uncritically. As a matter of fact, we may need to carve away parts of the self that are really not helpful or are even damaging to other parts of the self. We may have to make some difficult decisions. So Stoicism is not going to either embrace or overcome the self entirely. So what is the Stoic attitude towards the self? This is a very important fourth dimension of what's being discussed in this question. Stoicism is a teleological ethics. That means that it has an understanding of ends or purposes or goals, tele, right? This is what we get teleological from. And it thinks that we human beings not only engage in projects that have goals or ends, but there is also a goal or end for us to be a fully developed, fully realized human being. And that would mean to have a self that would be, you might say, free of inherent internal contradictions and conflicts, a self that has developed the virtues, a self that truly understands its place in the universe and its relations with other people and beings and behaves accordingly. Now notice I used that word self there. So Stoicism, you can say, has a teleological conception of the self, of what a fully realized human nature would look like, at least in outline, because this is extraordinarily rare. But it does give us a way to make progress in that direction. And part of the way in which we do that is not just going on a journey, but by looking within, by observing our own reactions on that journey and making oftentimes tough decisions about what parts we're going to keep and what parts we're going to try to get rid of, or at least, put into the background. So Stoicism is adopting a third stance, neither embracing nor overcoming, but rather transforming the self by the very use of the self into what the self is supposed to be. If you found this answer helpful for you, then please share it with others who might benefit from it. This work is entirely supported by crowdfunding on my Patreon site. So if you find it valuable, consider becoming a supporter at patreon.com/Sadler.